Our YouTube warbles on a lot here with a dispatch from the island incontinent of Abbottania, analysing the gap between what Tony the Mad Monk Abbott said when he was leader of the opposition and what he has achieved as Prime Muppet. Well, because it sells well in the redneck suburbs and in the bush too, Tony Abbott said he was going to stop the boats. Stop the boats. This is absolutely necessary because the national anthem says that Australia is girt by sea. The fact that for every person who shows up as a refugee with no papers on a boat, there are 54 people who show up on an aeroplane and overstay their tourist visa, that doesn't matter to either the right-wing conservative side of politics or to the alleged left-wing union-funded Labor side of politics. Don't forget, the Labor Party was founded by the unions to protect and preserve the White Australia policy. Stop the boats plays really well in the Australian electorate. But in Indonesia, Tony Abbott's declared plan of stationing Australian federal police officers and ASIO agents who were going to interface with the Indonesian military and Indonesian police in order to detect the imminent launching of a refugee vessel so that it could be intercepted before it ever was launched, that did not play well with the Indonesians, either the people or the military or the police or the public. So Tony Abbott went to Indonesia as soon as he was elected, and he apologised for the previous government having halted live cattle exports to Indonesia because the cattle were being beaten to death and tortured. And he allowed the Indonesians to buy a couple of 100 million acres of cattle farms in northern Australia so that they could make the claim that they were not importing Australian cattle, they were importing Indonesian cattle from land that they'd purchased in northern Australia. So Tony backpedalled, ate some humble pie, and the Indonesians agreed that they would cooperate on an intelligence and military level to suppress refugee boats going from Indonesia. So for a while it kind of looked like Tony Abbott had scored a little bit of a victory. Then he went to the Commonwealth holiday on government money in Sri Lanka. And in Sri Lanka they have a problem with Tamils who figure that 4 years after they lost the war, maybe they don't need to be tortured and beaten and hassled and locked up in camps and discriminated against by the Sri Lankan government. It was a 30-year war, it was very bitter. The Tamils invented suicide belts and suicide bombings. It wasn't for any religious reason, they were just secular rebels. So Tony Abbott went over there and he said it wasn't his place to judge human rights issues, but it was his place, seeing as he's so worried about boat people, that he would donate 2 Australian patrol boats to the Sri Lankan Navy so that they can better suppress the boatloads of Tamil refugees. It would be a little bit like the 1930s when Australia was troubled by boatloads of Jewish refugees from Adolf Hitler. We used to turn them around and send them back and tell them, no, you can't land here, but the Australian government did not contribute military equipment to the Dachau concentration camp guards in the hope that that would suppress the refugees from leaving Germany. Oh no, we weren't that bad, not in the old days. So, meanwhile, as all that was happening, Tony Abbott was also claiming he was going to axe the tax. Now here we mean the carbon tax, by which the Labor government attempted to reduce Australia's greenhouse gas emissions by 5%, based on either 1990 levels or 2000 levels. But 5%, not much of an achievement, but you know, it was a nudge in the right direction. Tony Abbott doesn't like the carbon tax. He doesn't think there should be a price on carbon. He doesn't think people should pay for what they use based on the damage that it does to the environment, because he thinks that global warming, he says the evidence is, to say the least, equivocal, and he thinks that climate science is absolute crap. So he just doesn't believe in it. He wants to go back to business as usual, but he wasn't able to politically sell that idea, so he's sticking with his idea of direct action, which pretty much means paying the big polluters to try not to pollute and plant trees. Plant trees all along the roadside so you can't see the broadacre farms and the erosion and the pesticides and the herbicides, and you can't see any of that because we'll plant trees. See, that's what we're going to do. camouflage, facade, fripperies. So, Tony Abbott got elected on an Axe the Tax platform. He abolished the Ministry of Science. Australia has a Minister for Sport, but not a Minister for Science. He cut 650, 750 jobs at the CSIRO, Commonwealth Scientific Industrial Research Organisation. He abolished the Climate Change Advisory Commission, but it started up again under private funding a week later. He tried to shut down the Green Energy Finance Corporation, but he hasn't got the numbers on the floor of the Senate, and it took an Act of Parliament to set that thing up, so it takes an Act of Parliament to disestablish it. So that hasn't worked out for him. He's got a Minister for the Environment who's taken over the responsibility for what the Minister for Science, Energy, Industry and Innovation used to do, a fellow called Kim Carr. And this new Greg Hunt, the Minister for the Environment, didn't even attend the Global Warming Convention in Poland because he was so busy on the floor of Parliament in Australia attempting to get the repeal of the carbon tax laws passed. Well, they passed it in the lower house, but it won't pass the Senate. So while Greg Hunt was not in Poland, the people who did go to the conference learned that whereas the politicians decided, with no scientific evidence to back it, that 2 degrees Celsius worth of warming was acceptable. On a global average of 15 degrees, they decided we could go to 17. The scientists said, like, gee, that's going to involve a lot of extreme weather, and we've achieved 0.8 of a degree of warming so far. And yeah, well, the Australian bushfire season shows up 6 weeks to 2 months early, and we get mega fires, down south of Sydney in October. And tornadoes are hammering the excited states again. The Philippines just had the biggest typhoon in the history of storms. 310 kilometres an hour winds for 6 hours, 20-foot tidal surge. But Tony Abbott and his side of politics get deeply offended. Anytime anybody says, oh, well, you know, like, the global warming science and the predictions said we were going to get extreme weather, now we're getting extreme weather, there's probably a connection with global warming. Oh, don't say that, that's politically incorrect. You can't talk about science and policy in the middle of a disaster. Well, we're going to get more and more of these disasters because the politicians don't want to consider the science. And in Poland, the science says that even if everybody keeps the pledges they've already made, and people like the Japanese are just backsliding woefully, they've given up on the idea of reducing their carbon emissions, and they think they might increase it a bit. China and America are both reducing, though. Europe is reducing. Well, that's good because, like I said, if everybody sticks to the pledges they've made, we're on track for 3.7 degrees of global warming by 2100. And if they go back to Tony Abbott's business as usual, let's ignore it all, let's hope it all goes away. His story is that Australia will not commit to increasing its greenhouse gas reduction beyond 5% unless and until the rest of the world signs on to firm and binding targets. So Australia's not going to be at the forefront of global warming mitigation. We're going to be the filthy, dag-ass, dirtiest bastards on the planet. We already have a bigger share of the global coal export market than Saudi Arabia has of the global oil export market. Australia, with 1/20th of 1% of the global population, is responsible for 4.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions, because that's how much coal we export. So, Tony Abbott's going to axe the tax. He's going to get rid of all the scientists. He's going to get rid of anybody who's capable of noticing a long-term trend. He also said he was going to return the budget to surplus because he reckoned that the Conservative side of politics was ipso facto, per se, automatically much more financially responsible than any Labor Green coalition could possibly be. It's just an article of faith with the man. He hasn't got any evidence that the Conservative side of politics is better at managing money, but he believes it is so. Yet, as soon as he got into power, his Treasurer, Joe Hockey, went into Parliament and said, oh, by the way, Australia's debt ceiling, which at the moment is $300 billion, We're approaching that debt ceiling. He wants to increase it by 200 billion, from 300 billion to 500 billion. That's a 60% raise in the credit card debt limit that Joe Hockey wants for contingencies. For contingencies. So that's what happened to return to surplus. It just out the window. No, we don't do that. He said he was going to stop the boats, and all he really did was stop talking about the boats. Instead of releasing a press release every time a boat showed up, they have a press conference once a week. It's like, you know, the Saigon Follies during the Vietnam War. And the rest of the time, the minister stands around saying, oh, well, I don't discuss operational matters. I can't talk about on-water matters. Hiding behind tradition-bound military protocols and precedents. I mean, if he was already in a shooting war with New Zealand or something, you could understand him being reticent about which naval boat was where and what it was doing. But seeing as what they're talking about is, you know, rescuing boatloads of Indonesians within sight of the Indonesian coastline, and Tony Abbott said when he was in opposition he was going to tow the boats back to Indonesia. And the Indonesians said, no, you won't. He said he was going to put spies in Indonesia, and they said, no, you can't do that, we'll do it for you. Just give us the money and we'll do the spying for you. So over the past month there's been a bit of a turn down in the number of boat arrivals, and Tony Abbott's been claiming credit for it. But when Greg Snowden's whistleblowing information regarding how Australia was using American equipment in Jakarta to tap mobile phones, when that information came out a week ago, the Indonesians said, well, we're really not happy about this. We think you should tell us you're not going to do it anymore. And Tony Abbott, Julie Bishop, the whole Australian Liberal National Government went into, oh, we can't confirm, we can't deny it. We never confirm or deny. I can't talk about, you know, whatever measures Australia takes. They spent a week saying how everybody does it, everybody spies, and the Indonesians just got the shits. It looked like it was calming down, and then the revelation came out a couple of days ago via the Guardian newspaper, which talked to the ABC, Australian Broadcasting Commission, which took, you know, fact-checked it, took it to the government, redacted a bit of it. What they released was that the American government, the same people that were tapping Angela Merkel's phone, gave the Australian Secret Squirrel Brigade some sparkly, shiny new American technology capable of tracking at least 10 mobile phones. And they set this thing up on the roof of the embassy in Jakarta, and they were tracking 10 mobile phones. 8 top ministers, the President and the President's wife. Now, Barack Obama was able to say to Angela Merkel, I didn't know it was going on, it's not happening now, and it won't happen in the future. Which is, between the lines, plausible deniability. Some middle-level spook who was in possession of the technology, who had the capacity, decided to use it and listen in, and if they heard anything that the President, or in our case, the Prime Minister, needed to hear from the phone taps, then the information would go up the line. But I do not believe that the titular head of state in either America or Australia actually signed off on an operational okay, yes, you know, you can go and tap the Indonesian Prime Minister's wife's phone and find out when she's getting a hairdressing appointment, because that's so fucking vital. We'd like to risk our entire international cooperation with that nation, because we'd just like to insult 215 million Indonesians to that level, because we think we are white supremacists, you know, like we're a little bit of Europe out here in the South Pacific, and we're entitled to spy on all those slanty-eyed, black-haired, yellow-skinned Asiatics. We are white men, okay? That's the attitude. That's the attitude of the dickhead who okayed this operation. So the Indonesians have withdrawn their ambassador to Australia, who's been called to Malacanang Palace to talk to the President. The Australian Prime Minister has addressed Parliament a couple of times, and he's used the word, he says he deeply regrets the embarrassment that the Indonesians feel But he's still refusing to confirm or deny that the act happened, and he's refusing to give an assurance that it won't happen in the future. Okay, so the Indonesians have broken off all military and intelligence cooperation with Australia. So they're no longer going to do anything to hinder the people smuggling, which was already going on at a pretty good clip, because, you know, the head Indonesian people smuggler is in jail for stabbing somebody and murdering him, and therefore he rents an extra room in the jail to keep his people smuggling business happening, and he has tables covered with cash notes, and he goes off to a nightclub every night from jail and returns back to jail. So there's a lot of official connivance was already happening. Now there's going to be more. So yeah, Tony Abbott's Stop the Boats campaign has just fallen in a heap because he hasn't got the imagination to copy what the Americans did with Angela Merkel. Oops, sorry, that won't happen again. And kick the arse of the dickhead who decided to do it. Oh no, Tony Abbott's protecting Australia's national security. He's not. He's protecting the security pension of the pension plan of the idiot who decided on that phone tap. That's what's going on. He's like a cat scratching on lino. He thinks that if he just keeps a stiff upper lip and bluffs it out, the pesky little Indonesians will forget about it. They fucking won't. They might just stop trading with you. They might kick all the Australians out. Or they might do something like they did in Bali when they got the shits with communists and chopped the fucking lot of them up with machetes. You know? How many tens of thousands died there? That's what Tony Abbott risks. Because he thinks it'll all go away if he just sweeps it under the carpet. It's worked with every other bullshit, harebrained idea he's come up with. Stiff upper lip, smile, move on. He's the bloke who said sometimes it's better to apologise afterwards than ask permission beforehand. So he's tried to tow 2 boatloads of Indonesians back to Indonesia after the Indonesians said no thanks. He's a clown. He's a fucking idiot. His global warming denialism and his business as usual at any cost to the environment attitude, plus his undisguised racism regarding Asiatics and brown people wanting to emigrate to Australia as internationally recognised refugees from torture, he's making Australia into a filthy, fascist pariah. And he thinks he's standing up for Australian values, for democratic virtues. It's a fucking 3-ring disaster. It really is. Axe the tax, stop the boats, return the budget to a surplus. So what he's done is he's unleashed a floodgate of boats from Indonesia. He's not quite got us into a shooting war, but this is apparently a much graver international crisis than it was when Australia and Indonesia went head to head over the liberation of East Timor. Right? The Mad Monk has been in office for less than 3 months, and he has managed to deeply offend Australia's largest, nearest neighbour.
Helen Pereira with ABC News. The Deputy Opposition Leader Tanya Plibersek has described as highly inappropriate comments from a Liberal Party pollster about top Indonesian government figures. Posting to Twitter, Mark Textor made disparaging remarks that appeared to be about the Indonesian Foreign Affairs Minister, Marty Natalegawa. The opposition's Foreign Affairs spokeswoman, Tanya Plibersek, says the loose comments do nothing to repair relations with Indonesia after the spying revelations.
Frankly, I was quite shocked at their highly inappropriate comments. I'm pleased to say that I'm pleased to be told that they've now been taken off the Twitter feed.
The Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, says the government won't sign up to a multinational trade agreement if it's not in Australia's interests. Australia and the US are part of a group of 12 countries negotiating a free trade agreement called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But there are concerns the secret negotiations will result in higher prices for medicines in Australia. Speaking in Washington after talks with her US counterpart, John Kerry, Ms Bishop says negotiations are continuing.
But we're certainly ambitious, yet pragmatic about how long it will take to conclude such an agreement. But I won't go into the detail of it because negotiations are underway, and we will certainly not conclude an agreement that's against Australia's national interest. We'll conclude an agreement that is in Australia's national interest.
So there you go. While the Australian government is officially saying no comment was the stern reply, the money men in the Liberal Party backrooms are twittering and tweeting insulting things about the Indonesian government. I tell you, the Liberal National Party couldn't organise to get fucked if they were working in a brothel as a bloody car park attendant. There, never mind. Maybe they'll have a temper tantrum and call a double dissolution election, and the Vox Populi will get a chance to repair their obvious fucking error. Ah, look, if pigs had wings, they'd be pigeons. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.